we're going to take a look where we left off in Genesis chapter 12. I'm going to give people another minute or so. It's not even 7:05 yet. I'm going to give people another minute or so to come on, and I will tell you, and I guess I'm telling this now on Facebook too. We had a wonderful AIPAC lobbying session today with our Congressman Mike Garcia, and Mike has been a wonderful friend to Israel since he was elected, and he is very knowledgeable about Israel's defense situation as a guy who's a former Navy pilot and as somebody who's also worked for a defense contractor, because he was working, I think, with Raytheon when he was first out of the Navy, out in in our area, which does a lot of work out in Palmdale and in this area, where we still have defense work, thankfully, a little bit, but we talked to Mike about three issues that we're talking to the AIPAC is talking to every congressperson across the country, Democrat, Republican, Independent, it doesn't matter. There was three things that were on the agenda. One was the Iron Dome, getting funding for the replenishment of Iron Dome. The second one had to do with Iran, and the third was pretty much making sure that again, the level of support from U.S. for the overall qualitative edge that Israel is supposed to maintain over its enemies continues to happen. And Garcia said something that was nice for all of us to consider, where he said that it seems as though the other side of the aisle, and again, he's not, he's a Republican, but he was talking about how a few months ago it looked like the Democrats were really swinging to be fairly critical of Israel and on aid packages, and right now it's not the case. And actually, and we kind of talked about it a little bit today, the Iron Dome is a critical issue because Israel spent a huge amount of their Iron Dome supply of anti-missile missiles during this last Gaza campaign, and so Israel needs to have a replenishment. They're not asking for new missiles or a new system, like a different kind of missile. They just need to be able to purchase, be able to buy replenishment stock for these missiles. And in order to do that, there needs to be an approval at Senate. It passed the House, but it kind of got held up in the Senate, and it got kicked back because they wanted to try to do it as unanimous consent. And there was one senator who did not agree to it. 99 senators agreed to have the Iron Dome be replenished. There was one senator who voted against. Does anyone want to guess who that one senator was? Anybody? Some of you might know.
AOC?
No, she's not a senator. She's a congressman. Nope, this was a Republican.
Bernie Sanders.
Nope, this was a Republican.
Oh my God.
No, it was a Republican. So come on, you should know he's from. His father was also not a very good friend of Israel, to put it mildly, as a Republican.
Oh.
Milken.
Rand Paul.
Oh, Rand
The correct
Paul.
answer was Rand Paul. So Rand Paul would not agree to a unanimous consent, and so gets kicked back, and then it has to go back to a discussion. So his take on it was, or his answer was, that he doesn't want to pass anything through a unanimous consent, but I don't know if that's the case. Probably the real issue is that he is not really as pro-Israel as most other Republicans are, and he was allowed, or kind of extended that by saying he doesn't plan on voting against it, but he also really gummed up the works on it, because what happens now is it has to get kicked back, and it goes through a whole process of appropriations. And unfortunately, thankfully, it doesn't look like it's going to be time critical, but it could have been, and it just wasn't nice. So that was brought up, and hopefully, again, this will be rectified, that we'll have these Iron Domes replenished, and then Israel will not have to worry about, this happening. And again, he could not be stronger on working on that with us. And he's on the Appropriations Committee. Mike Garcia is, which is the House committee that's in charge of this. So it's a very important thing that they do have to work cooperatively between the Democrats and Republicans on getting this done. Kay Granger is on the Appropriations Committee. Kevin McCarthy is on the Appropriations Committee. It's really one of the most important committees in Congress. The Appropriations Committee is like one of the most important. And so the fact that Mike is on that is really a great thing for us. It's a great thing for him. And so hopefully in that position, he'll be able to do what he has to do in the background. And again, also, he said he'll be very strong on, and he believes in holding Iran accountable. And so it was a very good conversation. We had about a half hour with him today. And it was, I can only report only positive things came out of that meeting. And I can assure you that he is very, very connected. There will not be a policy conference for AIPAC again this year because of COVID. So there is no, this will be the second year in a row. There won't be one in February. And so there won't be a policy conference this year, but we're still doing lobbying. We're still meeting with people through Zoom, and it's still a great way for us to do that. So everybody, well, not everybody, but a few of the people got to speak, and they put me in charge of speaking about the Iron Dome work. So I was honored to be asked to do that, and I hope you hear good news. I'm almost positive we'll hear good news about it, but let's just hope Israel never has to use it, but most likely they will. And most likely, again, this is something that Israel will have to be dealing with for a long time, unfortunately. So
it's essential defense. It's not an offensive weapon. It's essentially
correct.
We've got to protect.
Correct. And almost everybody, Republican and Democrat, voted in favor of it
Good.
in the House before. And as I said, it would have passed. I mean, Bernie Sanders voted in favor of it. Everybody voted in favor of it, except for Rand Paul. So yeah, I'm looking at it right now, October 8th. So I will say that the story I'm reading right now from the Times of Israel says that he also asked for funding for humanitarian aid for Gaza Strip as part of it, but that was his way of kind of catering to
Even-handed.
Yeah. So that is part of the story too. But again, that he was not one who held up. And I don't know, I can only see the, yeah. Yep. It's Time of Israel says, meanwhile, it is a Republican Party that's holding up the Iron Dome with Senator Rand Paul blocking attempts by Democrats to fast track the bill. So I can't remember what the vote was in the House, but it was, I'll just say, the only votes I think against it in the House. Oh, one Republican voted no. I was probably Justin Amash, but there was 8 Democrats and 1 Republican. It was 420-9. Let me say that again, 420-9.
Pleased to hear that. That's good.
Do you understand what I just said? 420. Nothing in Congress passes with 420 votes. I mean, that's insane. So, I mean, it's not all the votes. Some people, voted present, and some people weren't there, obviously. But that's phenomenal, folks, to have that kind of support for Israel. And that's largely, again, the work that AIPAC does to try to keep this from being nonpartisan, and for Israel's funding not to be held up by politics and these kinds of things. So unfortunately, as it stands right now, the Iron Dome funding has been hampered by politics, but not the kind of partisan politics that we would normally say. I will say that. So we'll kind of leave it at that. If you want to know the 8 Democrats that voted against it, I remember that AOC did vote in favor, and she said it was hard for her to do that, which was kind of strange because it was just because it was just a defensive thing. Oh, it was Rashida Tlaib. She voted against it.
Yeah.
And I don't see all the people that voted against it, but oh, wow. So anyways, we'll see what happens, but keep an eye on it, folks. Keep an eye on it, and I'll help you keep an eye on it. I'll bring your attention to it when stuff happens. But things are going on, and we're staying busy and trying to do stuff. I'm going to share up this section. So stuff is going on, even while we're not able to function normally. We're doing our best to at least function on the level of importance right now. So where we finished in the Torah last week, as we were looking at the story of Abraham and Sarah. At this point, they're still Avram and Sarai. Is that they were? We really took a long look at these verses that talked about Avram being blessed and being a blessing and being the source of blessing for everybody, and the fact that this really is the cornerstone of a lot of the philo-Semitism, the love for Jewish people that we have today. And that verse, the 12:3, I will bless those who bless you and curse those that curse you. And the fact that this becomes, again, a place where we have so much support and so many people who love Israel based on these lines. And so, again, it's something that you need to be aware of. We also read that Avram is 75 years old when he starts his journey to Canaan. It says who he took with him. It says he took his wife, Sarai, and his brother's son, Lot, which is another way of saying his nephew, but they don't really have a word for nephew. So they have a word for uncle, but not for nephew. So it's Ben Achiv, the son of his brother. And it says, and the people that they acquired in Haran, which we talked about last week, is a strange phrase, asher asu, the people that literally the souls that they made. And because it doesn't seem like it's the normal, and we'll see why today, why it's the normal phrase for bringing in like slaves as property, where it actually says that they made their souls, that the rabbis interpreted that to mean that they were starting to bring in converts. They're already starting to bring in people to this new way of thinking about God and the world. And so it is an interesting phrase, because we are actually going to see this week that Avram does acquire slaves, and there it's pretty clear that they're slaves. This seems to be a little different. This work that he does in Haran, which we also said last week is a place named after his brother who died young, Lot's father. So they head off to the land of Canaan. And so what it says, and where we kind of left off here, is that he passed as far as the site of Shechem, which was a city in those days, the Canaanite city. Later on, it's a city that Jacob will camp in front of. It's where Dinah, his daughter, Jacob's daughter, is actually raped or taken, whatever you want to say, taken against her will, taken without family permission. That happens in the city of Shechem. And today, Shechem is known as the city of Nablus, which is a Palestinian city, and is one of the places we can say for sure is not inhabited by Jews. It's not like Hebron, which has a Jewish enclave within it, the place where the graves of the patriarchs like Avram and Sarai are. No, not a Nablus. Nablus doesn't have a Jewish enclave in it. It is a very much the heartland of the Palestinian people. So this is interesting, because this is one of those sites that's mentioned here as a city which at the time was inhabited by the Canaanites. But it says here that God appears to Avram and says, I will assign this land to your offspring. And it says that Avram builds an altar there to the Lord who appeared to him. And so we understand that when Avram builds an altar, it's as if he's saying, okay, this is maybe not my place now, but in the future, my descendants will look at this place and they'll know that I was here, that I offered a sacrifice here, and I kind of dedicated it. Avraham never builds a city in his entire life. He never builds a city. He only builds altars. And the only piece of land that he ever actually purchases or lives in, if you will, for a long time is his grave.
His grave.
Very interesting that this is Avram's legacy to us. Is how he asserts and how he kind of affirms where this land is and how this land will be holy, not through the buildings, not through the settlements, if you will, but through these altars, these holy places. And so he says he builds an altar there by the terebinth of Moreh. It says literally there, Elon Moreh. Elon is the Hebrew word for oaks. The fancy word for it in English is a terebinth, which is a word we never use anymore, but they still use it in translation. But it's literally an oak grove. And so that's probably, again, a better translation than terebinth, because terebinth is not a word that we would use today. But we would use the word alone. It's still a name that's used for people. Actually, the name alone is used, it's used very commonly in Israel. For alone is a name for a boy. Alona or Alana is for a girl. I would say that the name Elon is also a derivative of the word Elon, which means an oak, a tree of strength. So I assume that's where Elon Musk got. He's not Jewish, but he assumed he got his name from the Hebrew word alone. And it's where the word Alonim, Camp Alonim at Brandeis, comes from the word alon, which means oaks. The Alonim are the oaks. It would be another way of saying terebinth. I'm just looking to see how Friedman translates as that. He calls it the oak of Moreh. He says just the oak rather than oaks, but there could be like a definitive and known tree amongst those trees, like the oldest or largest tree of the oaks. But most likely, again, it is an area where there was a little oak grove. And so this is where Avraham makes this altar. And again, in a place that is a natural space. It's not like he built a city or built a temple, if you will. This is much more of a shrine, an altar in the wilderness, really, if you think about it. So this is a place of holiness. And it says, from there he moved to the hill country east of Bethel and pitched his tent in Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And he built an altar, and invoked the Lord by name. And it says literally he called God B'Shem Adonai, which I think is important. And the translation I don't think really conveys this, is that when it says he invoked the Lord by name, what we're really talking about is he calls God Adonai. He calls B'Shem Adonai. He's calling God the name Yud-He Vav-He. So later on, when God appears to Moses and says, my name is Yud-He Vav-He, my name is Adonai or Hashem, however you want to translate those letters, the reality is it saying that Avraham also called God by name, used that personal name for God, not just Elohim, not just I call you God, but literally Lord or Hashem. It's like the personal name for God. It's actually saying the name of God, which of course we don't pronounce. We use the word Adonai, but there's this understanding that this is a personal and more intimate way of talking about God. So this is very clear that Avraham does this too. It says so specifically. He invoked Vayikra B'Shem Adonai, that he called God by the name Adonai. So it says that Avraham then journeyed by stages towards the Negev, which is another way of saying he's moving south. And he's moving south by stages. Now, the next line, literally the next line tells us that there was a famine in the land, and Avram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. So this is a part of the Bible that some people are familiar with and some people aren't familiar with, which is that in the middle of Avraham's journeying around the land, there's a famine. And his response is to go to Egypt. Now, let's make it real clear. Nowhere here does it say that God told him to go to Egypt. I will tell you that there is a little bit of a question in our tradition, which means the rabbis posed this as a question. Did Avraham have permission, or was he directed to go to Egypt, or was this just his idea? And if this wasn't his direction from God, and it doesn't seem like it was, it seems like he's in the middle of least the way the Torah presents it, he's in the middle of surveying and kind of journeying around this beautiful land that God has given him and promised him. And all of a sudden he darts off or keeps going south, and he heads to Egypt. So he's going south, but all of a sudden it's like he's not even paying attention anymore. He's heading right to Egypt because there's a famine. So there's a reason for it. And according to other sources and the rabbis, he had to. There's an interesting thing that goes on here with the way the rabbis treat this, which is that on one hand, they don't want to be too hard on Avram for doing this. And so they talk about this is not an ordinary famine. This is a famine that just was completely destructive, like nothing left. There was nothing for him to do. And there's another side of this, which is God just told him that this is his land. God didn't tell him, yeah, but when things get tough, you can always go to Egypt or always go, you can always head off somewhere else to get food. So this is an important issue, because what it actually leads to is this question of, did Avraham have enough faith yet in God? And if he didn't, did he need to be tested? So to some extent, this scene, some people say, not everybody, but there's a very old tradition that this scene of Avraham showing a lack of faith is actually why we have the Akedah story. It's only 7 chapters from now. We'll be reading the binding of Isaac, where Avraham is told, take your son. Now, when people say, well, why did Avraham need to why did he need to prove anything? He's already shown God that he is willing to go on a journey and uproot himself and go to the land that God will take him to. So why does he need to prove his faith? But people say, but because of this, because he doesn't seem to yet have enough faith. He has some faith. He has faith when God tells him, I'm going to bless you and your offspring and everything will be good. But if God isn't speaking to him, does he have enough faith? Does he have enough inner faith? Is there enough energy in him yet so that he can be sustained through what inevitably is going to be a tough life? So somebody was going to say something, jump in, but please.
I was just going to say, don't we have evidence that there was a great famine at this time?
What do you mean? Archaeological evidence?
That there was a big drought, that it caused a big turbulence at that time during the.
Well, here's the thing.
I know we don't know exactly.
There is a tradition, and because we're going to see this is not the only famine, right? Of course, you know about the famine that happened during Jacob's time. So there's a real question whether what is the level of these famines? How dangerous are these famines? The Torah seems to say that the famine was really bad, but was it really bad? I mean, it says severe. It says it's bad, but
well, haven't I read that? You wouldn't know what I've read, but that the Hittites and Egypt and all, there was a great famine at a certain time that had a big impact on the civilizations around there. Well, and I thought that's why Abraham left.
Yeah, but see, the thing is that these famines, the cycle of famines happens throughout Abraham and Jacob's time. And then there's other famines later on in the Bible. But the question is, are these supernatural famines? Are these normal famines? And more importantly, you see, here's the thing. The rabbis know, and we know this well. When God wants to provide food for somebody, for all nation, God can provide manna, right? So if God can provide food for people on a massive level, couldn't God provide food for Avram? Did Avram really have to go? And so, there's a question, well, let's put it this way. So this opens it up for discussion. But there's also this fine line that the rabbis want to walk between saying that Avram does something wrong here, and on the other hand, they're very, very careful and very respectful of Avram, and they don't want to show any weaknesses, and they don't want Avram to have too many critical lapses so that happens. Now, it's possible that part of the issue here is that when the rabbis, like all of us, when they read the Akedah, when we don't want to jump the gun, though we know this story really well, when we read the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, when we read that story, the rabbis were feeling the same thing that you and I feel, which is that, did you really have to do this to Avram? Did you really have to put him through such a horrific test? And so to some extent, if Avram, this again, it's not necessarily a massive failure, but if he does need to prove his faith, then you can make the argument that God does something that is, again, trying to make Avram prove himself. Because one can make the argument, in which they kind of are, which is that maybe this was a test too. Now, it doesn't say that, I know, it doesn't say that, but was this famine a test? And how does Avraham respond to this test, to said test? Well, let's take a look, because one can make, again, as they do, the argument that this is a critical scene in the book of Genesis, and maybe again throughout the whole Torah. Because watch what happens here when they go to Egypt. Now, we're already thinking, if you've never read this story, and you don't know this story, you forgot this story, or the story is not something that you're thinking about regularly, I don't know, most people, the first thing you think of when you think about Egypt is being a slave in Egypt. Now, a lot of people don't realize that we've already had a foray, we've already had a little introduction to Egypt during the time of Abraham. So a lot of people don't know this story. It's not the most famous story of the Bible, but even if you don't know this story, when we hear the word Egypt, we start to think about the pharaohs, and we start to think about the slavery, and we start to think about the 10 plagues, and we start to think about Passover. So inevitably, we start thinking about Egypt. Now, everybody, let's say, who's reading this story for the first time, interestingly, even if they're hearing the story, even if they're only listening to the story, it's very interesting, because we would assume that even little kids, when they first started celebrating holidays and they're eating matzah and they're sitting around a table, they've learned about Egypt before they've learned about Abraham. Even though this comes first, no one learns the Bible chronologically. You really don't. You may think you did, but you never did, because you might have learned the story of Adam and Eve, or maybe you learned the story of Noah first, or maybe you learned the story of Moses first, or maybe you learned the story of King David first. There's constantly foreshadowing and things that go back and forth in the Bible. And what's interesting about this is that sometimes it's not really foreshadowing. It's the fact that you already know and have an association with something, so that when you hear it in the Bible and you realize that it happened in the past, you already have this baggage and all of these assumptions that you take with you as we go down this road. And that's what we're going to do when we go down this road into Egypt. For those that don't know this story, let's go to Egypt with Avraham and Sarai. So here's what happens when they go to the land. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, "I know what a beautiful woman you are." I know. I love that. I know what a beautiful woman you are. And that's what it says. Yadati, I know what a beautiful woman you are. If the Egyptians see you and think she is his wife, they will kill me and let you live. Please say that you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that I may remain alive thanks to you. Everybody with me so far? You just read what you just read, what I just read. You just heard it. Avram is asking Sarai to pretend to be his sister when they go to Egypt.
That's the second thing that demonstrated that he was not perfect. He was a good man, but he was not a perfect man.
Yep. And he definitely doesn't have faith in the Egyptians. So if he doesn't have faith in God, okay, that's possible. If he doesn't think God's going to protect him yet, that's possible, because
Here's the Egyptians.
he's just gotten to know God. But now he's also very, very skeptical of what's going to happen to him when they go to Egypt, which means that he knows that there's a famine, that this is what he has to do. But to some extent, think about it, folks, he's willing to risk his life, or he has to risk his life in order to go to Egypt to get the food. or again, in his mind, this is what he's happening, because he just said, I'll get killed if they find out that you're my wife. And so he's essentially having to pretend in order to stay alive. So this is a risky situation for him. So whatever risks there are back at home with staying alive, he's willing to risk that now. And so this is why this scene is so powerful, because he's essentially forcing his wife to lie in order to do this. Now, as I told you before, the rabbis are loath to have Avram be a liar and not be a nice guy and not be an ethical guy. And so the rabbis would rather him engage in a relationship that is not completely, maybe by our standards, quite as distant as it needs to be. Why? Because he's not exactly brother and sister, but if Sarai is this woman that we talked about last week, Iscah, Milcah's the other sister of Haran, maybe that she's his niece, in which case she's not his sister, but she's a relative. So the rabbis say that he's really kind of stretching the truth, but he's really not lying. And so, well, he's omitting the facts for sure, but they really don't like the idea that he'd full out lie, which is why they like this idea that Sarai is actually another name for this woman, Iscah, that we were introduced to last week, who's part of his family. So that's another way that the rabbis kind of get away with him not being as deceptive as it appears that he is. They'd rather him be married to his niece than for him to lie. That's kind of my point. But again, keep in mind, this is part of the balance that they have to walk with this. Now, I will say this. We can talk about Avram. We can talk about what he does. We can talk about his lack of faith. We can talk about all that. But the fact that he was worried that when he goes to Egypt, he's going to be killed because of his wife being beautiful says a lot about what the Egyptians were capable of doing. And so before we move on, let's just for a moment pause to reflect that is what at least Avraham thought could happen to him when he went to Egypt. Now, Egypt is by far the most advanced civilization at the time, without question. For Avram, for the whole world, Egypt is far and away the most advanced society. But yet in this society that he's about to enter, he is worried for his life because they are capable of killing him and taking Sarai as the fact that this is a possibility tells you that Egypt was messed up. And for all of their advances and for all of their civilization and technology, ethically and again, the way they're behaving as a society is frightening to people. It's at least frightening to Avram. And so keep in mind, before we just assign blame to Avram, let's also think about what he has to deal with, which is a world where this is a possibility. Now, there are other times and places where this was a possibility. But normally, if we said that this was the kind of behavior that you'd worry about when you went traveling with your spouse, number one, that's not a place that we're going to go to on vacation. That's not normally a place where we're going to be taking a cruise to, let alone the assumption that this is also the highest advanced culture of the time by far. So this is, again, a condemnation of Egypt and what is possible, what can happen there. So keep that in mind. Don't let that out, because, and it really does need to be said. What does it say about the Egyptians that would be on the table when you go there? Well, part of it comes true, or at least, again, we'll never know what would have happened if he had said that it was his wife, because most definitely when Avram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw how beautiful the woman was. And Pharaoh's courtiers saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken to Pharaoh's place. And it doesn't seem like they had a whole lot of say in it. It doesn't seem like they came to Avram and said, hey, can we take your sister to the palace? It just says they came and took her. The woman was taken. So vatikach, they took her. They literally like took her. Doesn't say they purchased her, that they asked for permission. It doesn't say that they came in and negotiated. Hey, would you like to have us take your lovely sister as our bride, as a bride to our Pharaoh? So she was taken. Okay, so at least that part was true. At least that part Avram was 100% right about. They saw how beautiful she was and they took her. I do want to point out
They didn't kill him.
they didn't kill him, well, because they thought it was his brother, right? And you'll see, not only did they not kill him, they're going to pay him. But so they do pay him. I mean, there is a payout for this.
Yeah.
But the payout comes after they took her. It says they took her, and then there's a payout. So there is a basis that doesn't seem like Avram was just out of his mind for thinking this. But I do want to point your attention to the fact that Sarai, based on our calculations of how old they are, is 65 years old when this happens. So lest you think that this is a 25-year-old woman, her beauty at 65 was still so overwhelming that the Egyptians didn't know what hit them. And what's really special about this, of course, is not just that she's our ancestor and that every Jewish woman is a descendant of Sarai, right? Is either a physical or spiritual descendant of Sarai, because every woman is a descendant of her, either because we're all Hebrews or because as we convert to Judaism, we say we're a child of Avraham and Sarai. The beauty that this woman had was so overwhelming that the Egyptians didn't know what else to do other than bring her right to Pharaoh. So there was no do not pass go. She's going right to Pharaoh. So it tells you that this woman who came as a guest or came as a visitor ends up essentially being brought into the home of Pharaoh, if not as a queen, then at least as a part of the harem and part of the part of what seems to be some high value that Pharaoh had to her. Because what happens? Because of her, it went well with Avram. He acquired sheep, oxen, asses, male and female slaves, she-asses, and camels. Now, here it says all the things that he got, and it says that he got male and female slaves. And here it says that he has these things, and they're called slaves. This is different from the people that he made in Haran. Here it clearly calls them slaves. And it says male slaves and female slaves. So he gets lots of valuable things from being there. Now, I will tell you that it's a commentary, but it's not a huge stretch to say this. One of those female slaves, most likely, though I can't prove it because it doesn't say, was Hagar. Because we read later on, maybe later, probably not today, but next week, or the week after, is that Hagar is a Egyptian slave. And she is the one that Sarai ends up putting up as the handmaid in her place. So this story, the repercussions from this story are felt later on. So this story, you will see, has some lingering effects, perhaps on our history, on human history. That this little scene here that we sometimes forget about in chapter 12, this little scene that we're in the middle of right now, might be one of the places where history went in a different direction, where we can ask ourselves, what if Avram hadn't gone to Egypt? So what happens here? He gets all this property, he gets all this wealth. And what happens? The next verse, the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his household with mighty plagues on account of Sarai, the wife of Avram. Now, I will tell you, and again, when we look at the word that's used here, it is negaim gedolim, which they translate as mighty plagues, but it's big. Gedol means big, and nega for a plague is not the usual word we have for plagues. I will tell you that when we read about plagues during the 10 plagues, which by the way, very rarely calls them plagues. It very rarely calls them out as a plague. It'll say this happened and that happened. But the word for plague that's used elsewhere in the Bible, which is magefa, is oftentimes that's used. It's not the word that's used here. The word here that's used is naga, which actually has a connotation less of a plague and more of an affliction. I'm just curious to see how Friedman translated this, because usually, again, no, they use the word big. He used the word big plagues, yeah, it says big plagues, but the word naga is not the word that's oftentimes used for plagues. It's oftentimes has more of a physical affliction to it rather than just general plagues like we normally think of the 10 plagues that happen in Egypt. That being said, I don't want to dwell on it too much. And again, whether it's a magefa or whether it's a plague, and that's why, by the way, sometimes it's seen as that the plague that he's afflicted with is more on his body, like boils or one of those other kinds of skin diseases. Because oftentimes the word naga is used in conjunction with sarat, that disease that we see in Leviticus. That's where we see the word naga used the most, rather than again magefa. So it's oftentimes like more a skin plague, if you will, literally like a physical plague, rather than again hail and frogs and those kind of things. So that being said, wow, look at that foreshadowing. Mighty plagues on Pharaoh and his household. So this is, again, the foreshadowing that we have. Though the fact is that most people, when they read this, already know about the plagues during the time of Egypt. They just don't know or aren't familiar or forgot that Egypt got hit with plagues during the time of Avram and Sarai. And again, it's connected to this whole scene of Avram going down. And again, you could say the Egyptians asked for it by creating a situation where Sarai had to be concealed, or her identity had to be concealed, but this is clearly a punishment. And look what happens. Pharaoh sent for Avram and said, "What is this that you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife?" So somehow they find out. It doesn't say how they found out, but they find out. Let's say, again, Sarai told him, why am I getting afflicted right now? Again, make it clear, God afflicted them. The Lord afflicted them. It's not like, well, it's just a coincidence. It says the Lord afflicted them. So they know something is supernatural here, and they confront Avram about it. Why did you say she's my sister and I took her as my wife? Now here is your wife. Take her and be gone. And Pharaoh put men in charge of him, and they sent him off with his wife and all that he possessed. Now, that's the end of the story. But is it really? Because as we know, we're going to have a few hundred years in Egypt, or at least a few generations as slaves in Egypt. And it's actually one of the rabbinic kind of conclusions here that the Egyptians had actually a justification for this enslaving us because of this trick that happened to them. So that, again, I'm only telling you, it's out there, and I didn't make it up. It's a 2,000-year-old midrash that essentially Avraham puts this cycle into play by going down there. Now, again, was some of it deserved by the Egyptians? Yes. That's not part, by the way, of you have to understand in the biblical sphere of like why things happen and how people get punished. There is oftentimes this understanding that people put into motion things that end up kind of getting out of control, which, guess what, is true. That's not a biblical thing. That's life. That sometimes we put things into motion that we can't control anymore. But what's interesting about it is that even if that happens, if people get punished because of it, their actions still dictate punishment. That's to say that we don't cut them a break because they made a mistake in the context of something happening, right? So if the Egyptians did have a reason for us to be down there, they still didn't have to make us slaves. So the fact that they made us slaves and kind of fulfilled that mission, if you will, or that action was somewhat of predetermined. It also speaks to their behavior that they enslaved us and tried to kill us when we were in Egypt. So they didn't have to do that, but yet they did. So it's not like God forced them to do it. Now you could say, well, God hardened Pharaoh's heart, but he didn't harden everybody in Egypt's heart. And he also, we can make the argument that he hardens Pharaoh's heart because Pharaoh has already been responsible for the murder of Jewish children. If not that Pharaoh, then the previous Pharaoh. So the Egyptians are responsible for their behavior. So the fact that we go back to Egypt, fine. Didn't say that God didn't tell them to kill our babies. So keep that in mind, that those biblical cycles, if you will, still don't get people off the hook. And you can't just say, well, the Egyptians were just doing their job. No, that's not okay. And we say they did their job and they'll be punished for doing their job. So keep that in mind. And there's that foreshadowing. As we also said, as we'll see in the story of Hagar, this is set up here. What that also means, that is, if Avram and Sarai don't go down to Egypt and they don't wind up coming back with Hagar, then there's no Ishmaelites. There's no Arabs. I mean, that's literally the conclusion that the rabbis also came away with from this scene. Because if Hagar doesn't wind up in the household, Sarai doesn't say to him, take Hagar as in my place and have a child with him. Just keep that in mind too. That's all part of the cycle that's going to happen. Again, you could say that's what had to happen. That was the way the Bible plays it out, but it doesn't mean, it still means that it's part of the cycle. It's in the cycle there. It's a possibility that that's the way it has to roll out, but it's still, the consequences they're still incumbent on the people who participate in this play, if you will. Hagar, Avram, and Sarai are all responsible for their behavior. I'm not jumping the gun. I'm only telling you that's how, to some extent, we just got introduced to Hagar. She came in the package, and now it says that Avraham left with that stuff, which means that he went down with some stuff, but he comes back with more. That's what it says. It says that he left with all that he possessed, which means they didn't say to him, well, we're keeping all the stuff that we gave you. We're keeping it. Now, I will tell you this. One of the reasons why the rabbis also liked the idea that this was a physical affliction was they did not like the idea that Pharaoh ever actually laid a hand on Sarai. That whenever he tried to come close to her, he's essentially gets sick. So he couldn't come close to her. I don't know, folks. I'm only going to tell you, you just read the line. Why did you say she is my sister so that I took her as my wife? Now here is your wife, take her and be gone. Now, nowhere does it say that they didn't sleep together. I will tell you, the rabbis were going to have none of that. None of it. That wasn't even something they wanted to visit. Not a possibility. Sarai never would have done that. I will only tell you, it does not say that in the text. On the contrary, it could have said that in the text, and it doesn't say that in the text. And it says specifically that he took her as his wife. we don't like the possibility that they did indeed have marital relations. But if they did, it was marital relations because he thinks that they're married. It doesn't say that she's a concubine. It doesn't say that she's part of the harem. It actually says, I took her as my wife. Now, it could be that he had lots of wives. I'm not saying that, but she wasn't just taken for a night, assumedly by that. But again, as the rabbis had it, there was no physical contact. No touching. I don't know, folks. I'm only going to tell you that scene would be problematic by itself. It would be problematic if there's no Hagar, if there's no consequences to this. However, there's more, because we're going to have this scene replayed later on, almost verbatim, that there's another scene where Sarai is pawned off as his sister. This doesn't happen once. It happens twice. And guess what? It happens once between Isaac and Rebekah. The motif, the story happens 3 times in the Bible. 3 times. Now, again, even if it's written by the product of a different author, okay, it's most likely that 2 of the stories, well, there's 3 stories, that 2 of the stories were from one author, and then 1 of the stories was from the other author, which means 2 things, by the way. When we get to it, we'll talk about it more. Please keep this story in mind from chapter 12 when we get to the story, the later story of Sarai. It means that, number 1, there is an author who has 2 versions, has 2 incidents where this happens. There's 3 stories, and there's not 3 different authors for this. I want to make this clear. There's either 1 author or there's 2 authors. But if there's 2 authors, it means that one of the authors has the incident happening twice. One of them would have it happen once. If that's the case, okay, fine. One author has it happening 2 times. But there's another thing. The fact that there are 2 versions of this story, at the very least, tells us that this story was one of those stories in the Bible that the editors of the Bible felt that they needed to have 2 versions of, because these versions of the stories were considered to be so well known and so accepted that they had to include them. When we look at stories where we have 2 versions of a story, creation, the flood, certain parts of Exodus that are so big, maybe like the Sea of Reeds. What is that story? By having 2 versions of the story, it doesn't tell us that the story wasn't important or that there's different versions of it because people weren't sure what happened. It tells us that everybody knew what happened. There was a northern story version of it. There was a southern story version of it. There was a priestly version of it. There was a J version of it. It just means that it's a really well-known story. It doesn't mean that it didn't happen. On the contrary, we can't prove that it happened, but it seems like everybody knew it happened. So this story about Sarai isn't one where we can just bury it and go, well, it's a fluky story. It's a story that we have at least 2 versions of. Well, we have 2 versions of, I would say, and maybe 2 versions of, but no matter what, we have 3 different versions of matriarchs essentially being given over as a wife to somebody else. It's a very, I mean, you can't ignore it. You can't just say, well, let's just throw these verses away. You can't. First of all, you can't. And second of all, but you repeated it 3 times. So just keep that in mind. We can't come away with any definitive answers, but we can't not recognize it. So chapter 12, we begin with Avram and Sarai being told, you shall be a blessing. Lord told him, go out of your land and to your native house, go from your house to a land that I will show you. It ends, literally, the chapter ends. And again, the chapters and verses were not put in by us, and I don't want to go too far over it. But literally 20 verses later, we've had this incident where like, what just happened? And we just had a woman maybe forcibly taken away from her husband, who has been told he's going to be a blessing to everybody. And now he's leaving with wealth. But did they have to go through that scene? Because it's very possible that a woman essentially, I don't know if you can say it, non-consensual sex might have just happened there, or some type of strange, almost prostitution level of a relationship happened. This is a dude who's been told he's going to be blessed. Does not seem like life is going to be so easy for the man. So I want to tell you, keep in mind that being a blessing and being chosen by God and having all of this good stuff being told is going to happen to you in the world, at least here by verse 20, Avram's not feeling great. He can't be feeling great right now.
If I was his wife, I'd be pretty angry.
I don't even know what Sarai's thinking. And that's where the Midrash is oftentimes silent, because women didn't usually write the Midrashim.
Yeah.
But at the very least, I'm perplexed, and I'm feeling like maybe being blessed doesn't mean that everything good will happen to you, because this can't be good. There's no level where we're going, well, at least Avraham got some goodies out of this. This is a weird scene where how do you even have them walking back? They're walking back now to Israel. And what do they say to each other on the way back? What do you say? What do you say to your wife on the way back after this happened? I couldn't protect you. I mean, there's so much here. I don't even know where to begin. I don't even know, thinking about this I'm only thinking about it honestly, I can only think about it from Avram's side. I can only think about it from the husband's side. I mean, honestly, I can't. I mean, I wish I could, from the standpoint of Sarai, I can't honestly do that. But I can tell you, as the husband's side, I'm walking back and I'm feeling completely, I'm feeling a lack of masculinity, the fact that I couldn't protect my wife, I couldn't provide for my wife, that my worst fears were almost realized. And what did I do just now? Can she ever respect me? I mean, I don't know. I mean, my mind goes to places where if I really identify with Avram, which I try to do, I try to identify with these people and try to understand their story. I mean, I'm feeling like I got kicked in the gut pretty hard. I mean, look, you read this and maybe when you're a kid, when I was a little kid, when I was reading this story, you go off, maybe you read it and go, wow, Avram just got a whole bunch of stuff and he didn't have to do anything. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I think I might have thought that when I was a kid. I mean, I think I might have thought that without being a husband or being responsible for being a head of a house. I might have even thought that. It's impossible to think about that until you're a spouse, until you're a husband, when you're literally saying, what just happened just now?
If my husband traded me for stuff, I'd be pretty angry.
Yeah, but the argument is that their lives were in jeopardy.
Yeah.
It's easy for people to make those decisions. You talk about how people survived the Holocaust and the decisions people had to make when they were trying to get out of Germany or wherever. I don't, we can't judge that. I mean, people did very questionably unethical things in order to get their families out of Germany or out of Austria in the 1930s. Literally, we talked about Kristallnacht last week. Like at that moment in 1933, 34, or 35, when people are, but then on 38 on the night of Kristallnacht, the next day, they're cleaning up the damage. And they're like, we got to get out of here. What do we have to do? What do I have to do? Who do you have to sleep with to get out of this country? I mean, what do you do? I mean, you honestly tell somebody, oh, well, sorry, we never let you do that. We never let you bribe these people or, whatever. I mean, what do? You're trying to survive. So all of these things, you can go through your head, and I guess the older and the more mature you get, the more you think about what really happened here in that moment. But wow, I mean, you can make the argument that at least he knows, I guess in the back of my mind, that God's going to protect him. I mean, I think I probably knew those midrashim that God didn't let Pharaoh touch her, but I'm not so sure that didn't. I'm not so sure that happened. I mean, I hope it happened. Like in the back of my mind, I'm like, yeah, I hope he didn't touch her, but am I really sure that I'm not so sure. And no matter what, how could Avraham feel? How could he feel like he could protect his wife? He couldn't protect his wife. God protected his wife.
It teaches is that you don't have to be perfect in order to lead the people. You don't have to do everything right. You can do some things wrong and you can still be a leader.
Yep. And it also will tell you that it doesn't matter whether God blessed you or not. You feel blessed. I mean, Avram felt blessed. Didn't mean that his life was going to be easy. That's not what it means. And so I remind myself, I remind other people that we can be blessed, and that doesn't mean, as we see with Abraham, that life is going to be perfect every day, and hardly. I mean, obviously, this is horrific at the very least. Even if he never touched her, even if he did, the whole scene is frightening because he was worried that he was going to be killed, and he couldn't do anything to protect his wife. So at the very least, that's the best case scenario that happened to Avram in this scene. But from there it can get really dark.
Yes.
Get really dark. Let's be honest. So yeah, it's a story this is a perfect example of the stories that we don't talk about with children. You just hit one just now. Because how do you even explain that to a kid? I mean, I have a hard time explaining that when a kid has Lech Lecha. I'm just giving you the example. I'm sitting here with a young person and I'm teaching them Lech Lecha. And they have the book. I mean, they have the translation in front of them of a Bible. And they read this great part about Avram being blessed. Okay, there's a famine in the land. And oh my gosh, I get 10 verses before I'm getting hit with this. Tell them that literally, you almost have to willfully cut people off so a kid can't. I'm not discussing that scene with a kid. I'm just not. I can't. I don't even know. I don't even know where to go with it. I wouldn't even start. So I'm just telling you that the Bible is not for children. When we teach the Bible, we have to really be careful and really have to cut and not cut, but kind of focus the attention on a page. And I've had a problem where kids have kept reading and they go, well, what about this? And I'm telling you, it's not easy. It's not an easy thing to do. And especially given the fact that I assume that, I assume that there's not going to be a lot of context for how these kids are going to learn these stories as well. So it is not a book for children. And that's unfortunate because most people stop reading it when they're children.
Right.
So this gives us so much to think about as adults. So that is the scene. The very next verse says that from Egypt, Avram went up to the Negev. So he goes back up to the southern part of Israel, the promised land for him, with his wife and all that he possessed, together with Lot. So Lot seems to be back in the picture. It doesn't seem like, again, Lot was with them when they went down to Egypt. It doesn't say that Lot was there, but he's definitely there. I mean, you could assume he's there, but now it says he's there. And that's going to be important into the next part of the story, Lot's role, because Lot is essentially originally Avram's, really his initial child. Avram's going to have several almost children, and Lot is one of them, his nephew. So it says Avram was very rich in cattle, silver, and gold. And he proceeded by stages from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had formerly been between Bethel and Ai. And we're talking about Bethel, between Bethel and Ai, not too far away from Jerusalem. So he's going back up from the south. And it says that he's going back up in stages, back up to not the north of Israel, but kind of the central area. So he's going from the south to the central part of Israel, not far from Jerusalem. The site of the altar that he built there at first. And there Avram invoked the Lord by name. Lot, who went with Avram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support them staying together, for their possessions were so great that they could not remain together. And there was quarreling between the herdsmen of Avram's cattle and those of Lot's cattle. And so it says right here that their shepherds, that their cowboys, if you will, start fighting with each other. The herdsmen start fighting with each other. So as oftentimes happens with pasturing, that they start to quarrel over rights. Now the problem is they're both Avram and Lot are they're nomads. They don't really have ownership of the land. Avram's been promised the land, and by extension, it seems like maybe Lot has been by being part of the household. But the problem is that there's not enough land, or at least pasturable land for their flocks. And so they start fighting. The herdsmen start fighting. Now, it doesn't say that Lot and Avram start fighting, but their attendants start fighting. Their crew starts fighting with each other. What's interesting about this, by the way, folks, is that if you've watched enough cowboy movies, and especially if you live in a place like Frisco, Texas, you can know that cowboy fights oftentimes were between different ranches. Now, usually in the movies, you got to have, the townspeople and the cowboys, and they don't get along, and that's oftentimes the way you see it in the movies. But in the stories that you read about, and the kind of the real stories of the West, a lot of these fights and a lot of these big gunfights were between ranch hands from cowboys from different ranches that would fight between, there'd be a fight between their crew. Either, they felt that someone was encroaching on the area that they normally take their cattle, or just a group of guys and another group of guys that, they get into a fight. And then, of course, one side fights with the other and it spills over. So that's what it seems to have happened. It seems to be the situation where they're fighting. And this is a very precarious situation, especially for two groups that are essentially, they're immigrants. They're neither one have a long claim on the land. And the Bible actually reminds us of that in the rest of the verse. It says the Canaanites and Perizzites were living then in the land. They were the ones who were dwelling there. They were the ones who were, if you will, in control. So this is happening. They're fighting while the Canaanites are in charge. And Avram said to Lot, let there be no strife between you and me, right? So let's get this over. We don't want to have a struggle, a quarrel between my herdsmen and yours, for we are kinsmen, which literally the translation is we are brothers. So he says, we can't have this fighting. Is not the whole land before you? Let us separate. If you go north, I'll go south. If you go, Lot looked around, Lot, if you go south, I'll go north. So he basically says, wherever you go, I'll go in the opposite direction. So Avram says to Lot, I'll let you pick and I'll just go in the opposite direction. So even though Avram was the older one, was essentially the father, he's treating Lot as a kinsman, as a literally a colleague or a peer. Didn't have to do that. He could have told Lot, this is where you're going. He doesn't. This is critical because he gives Lot the first opportunity to pick where he's going to go. So Lot looked about him and saw how well watered was the whole plain of the Jordan, all of it. This was before the Lord had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, all the way to Zoar, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. Now, what's so cool about this line, of course, is that he looks out at the Jordan Valley, which is at the time much more verdant than it is today. And he looks out at the Jordan Valley and he says, yeah, I'd like to be in the Jordan Valley. I'll take that. I'll take that territory, which is a no-brainer. It's a lot of water. It's got a lot of stuff around it. And the Bible just told us, this was back in the days when it was really verdant, before God destroyed it. So it tells us that God's going to destroy it. So a lot of people don't know this, that there is a definite foreshadow. And it's not a foreshadow. I mean, that's literally, oh, it's going to be destroyed. So we're told as readers that Sodom and Gomorrah are going to be destroyed. And the reason that we're told that here is because the author wants us to know that Avram let Lot take good territory at the time. Ends up not being so good, but Avram didn't know that at the time, and neither did Lot. From the way they looked at it at that moment, this is a great area to be in, the area of the Jordan Valley. And of course, he's going to be near Sodom and Gomorrah, which is key to the story and key to the rest of the narrative. So we're not at Sodom and Gomorrah yet. We're still about 5 chapters away, but we already have a little taste, a little precursor, a little foreshadow of what's going to happen. And the fact that Lot chose to be in that area. He chose to be near Sodom and Gomorrah. That's where he wanted to be. And it was, at least according to this, it was a no-brainer at the time. He looked at it and said, oh yeah, I like this. What's interesting about that area too, is it says that that area around the Jordan Valley was like the garden of the Lord, which is nothing other than Gan Eden. It's the paradise. And also like Egypt. So it tells us that Egypt and Gan Eden were the most beautiful places that people could imagine in those days. And at least as far as if you had to live in a place and know that there's going to be water and know that there's going to be sustenance and know that there's going to be green grass, that's where you want to be. Now, of course, it's not going to stay that way. And that's one of the things that makes the story of Sodom and Gomorrah even more amazing. And as we're going to talk about when we get to it, what we've discovered in the last few years is that that area was 100% a beautiful green area filled with very wealthy cities. And then in a moment, it was destroyed. In an instant, fire rained down on it from the sky, just as the Bible says. Now, again, we'll talk about it when we get to it, about what actually scientifically has been proven, but it has been proven just recently through geology and archaeology that that area got wiped out. And it got wiped out on a massive, and at the time, no question, would have been seen as a supernatural occurrence. So this is a story that reminds us that this area originally was a beautiful area. And this sets us up for the Sodom and Gomorrah story and a pre-Sodom and Gomorrah story that some of us don't know either, which is the story of how Avraham helped the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. These Canaanite cities, Sodom and Gomorrah are Canaanite cities. So here's what it says. Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. So he gives them north or south, but he says he went east. He doesn't go north or south, he goes east. So he goes east and then he goes west. So he said, you can go north or south. And he says, no, I'll go east. So he goes, fine, I'll go west. So they parted from each other. And Avram remained in the land of Canaan while Lot settled in the cities of the plain, pitching his tents near Sodom. And here's what it says. The inhabitants of Sodom were very wicked sinners against the Lord. And that's all it says there. It doesn't say anything else than that. That's it. That's all it says about them. But yet that's going to give us, again, a setup for what happens later. But it also means that we're knowing this before we read the next chapter.
What does the word Sodom mean?
What is stone? What is the origin of stone? So it's not wickedness. Okay, so the word stone actually has to do with the rock and the geological formations that are there. So just understand that this is not like it doesn't mean wickedness. Now we'd say, like, if you talk about a sodomite, what does it actually mean? What does it mean today if somebody says, oh, you're from Sodom, or such a place as Sodom and Gomorrah? It has a totally different meaning. But the words Sodom, I will tell you, the actual origins of those words have to do with the
just because that's often a clue.
No. I'll tell you. I will tell you the actual word of Sodom means. Let's see. Let me tell you what the actual word Sodom, the origin of the word Sodom is. And again, the word sodomy has become a word in English, but that's not what the word means. That's not what the word means in Hebrew. In Hebrew, it is literally, and I don't think that's correct. Here it says that it means literally fields. I guess that's probably part of what it means. But yeah, it has to do with the geology of it. I think it means more like a mesa, but I'm not positive. I'll look it up for you. But I think but again, it has to do with the geology of the area rather than having to do with the character or the behavior of the people, which of course in English today is completely connected to the biblical story, but not to what the word means in English.
And this is by the Dead Sea, Sodom and Gomorrah?
Yeah, right by the Dead Sea, right by the Jordan River, where the Jordan River empties out.
So they're saying all that area used to be green? Really?
And it used to be far more green. Now, part of it, we always thought that part of what happened here is that it's the Jordan Rift Valley. As we know, it's a very, very low below sea. It's the lowest point in the world below sea level, 1,700 feet below sea level. We know all that the mineral value, all that stuff, that there's no life in the Dead Sea anymore, all of that. But so we thought that was geological formations that happened over thousands of years, literally like hundreds of thousands of years. So originally that area of the Dead Sea was a lake called Lake Lusan, and it was a huge lake that would have been full of life. And that as the Jordan Rift Valley split apart, as Asia and Africa have moved away from each other, that it caused that valley to separate. There's been really bad earthquakes in that area, and that the area has gotten drier and drier and drier. That was that was what we thought. And so it was like we thought somehow the people knew that, but that stuff happened well before there were human beings living in, well before there were human beings anywhere. So the interesting thing is that we thought, well, maybe people understood that. They could look around the geology and say, oh yeah, there must have been a lake here at one point. Like they looked up and they saw 1,000 feet above them that there was water, which you can see. I mean, like anybody who goes to the Dead Sea and looks up to Masada knows that was underwater at one point. Just like when you go to the Grand Canyon and you look up and you go, oh yeah, this was water, right? This was a lake here, right? You see it. I mean, you know it. So maybe they figured that that's what happened. That's not what happened, as we're about to see. And again, I'll introduce it when we get to Sodom and Gomorrah. What it turned out was there were people living there, and we knew that people were living there because we found archaeological evidence. We found graveyards for thousands of people, which indicated that people were living there. And even during the time of when people were living there, it was far more verdant than it was. What we just discovered was there was 100%, without question, a natural, well, you could call it almost a supernatural, or maybe it was a supernatural occurrence, where the human beings that lived there were liquidated and burned up immediately by a collision from an asteroid onto the earth in that moment. There was a moment when everybody was living there literally burned up, exactly the way the Bible said it. So whether or not it happened during the time of Sodom and Gomorrah, during the time of Avraham, I'm not talking about that. And we don't know that. And we actually can't prove that. But the fact that there was oral stories about that area being wiped out, it's not that people watched that or looked at the area and said, oh, there must have been water here. There were lots of people living in that area at a certain point, and they were wiped out in an instant, literally blown up. And we found records of their bodies. We found records of their buildings literally being instantaneously evaporated by the heat generated by that collision.
So this change it, make it come to salt, make it become a salt, dry, low valley?
It definitely had an effect on the amount of people that lived there. I think that what happened is that the process of that Rift Valley continued over time, and over the last several thousand years became more and more pronounced. But whatever happened, people didn't want to live there anymore after what had happened there. And I think it also had a lot to do with the natural occurrences that do happen there, and the fact that there's huge sinkholes that develop in that area.
Well, there's not enough water there.
It's not and there's also tremendous amount of earthquakes in that area because of what's gone on with the Rift Valley. And those earthquakes affect all of Israel. And Israel has not suffered with a major earthquake lately, but that area is very prone to earthquakes, that Jordan Valley. So needless to say, people would eventually say, hey, let's not build a home here because, every couple hundred years, everything gets wiped out. So that's part of it too. It's not a very comfortable place to live. It still isn't. People don't live there. The people who live in the Jordan Valley now are essentially Bedouin people that take goats and stuff up there occasionally. There are not people that live out there. Even by the time of Jesus 2,000 years ago, the Essenes, the Dead Sea Scroll people who lived there, they lived there because nobody lived there and nobody wanted to live out there. So still nobody lives out there. It's not a hospitable place, and it is not a place where people live. So there is no water, so people don't want to live there. But even when they can get water there now, they still don't want to live there. So the next line says that the Lord said to Avram after Lot had parted from him, raise your eyes and look out from where you are, to the north, to the south, to the east and the west. For I give you all the land that you see, to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, then your offspring too can be counted. So this is the line where we have this promise that you will be like the dust of the earth. You will be like as numerous as the dust of the earth. And the last line, up, walk about the land through its length and breadth, for I give it to you. And so God is again telling Abraham that everything you see is yours. Now, why does this happen after Lot finally separates from him? Well, it seems to be a clear indication that this is your land. It's not Lot's land. This is not Lot's land. This is your land. Lot's family is now getting another piece of land. And I think that is critical for at least the way the Bible sees the Ammonites and Moabites, who are Lot's descendants, the two nations of Ammon and Moab, who live on the other side of the Jordan River in today's modern Jordan. Where they lived was the area that Lot essentially had chosen, which is not in the land of Israel anymore. Lot's people have no claim based on this to anything that's in front of them. Only Avraham's descendants, only the people who will directly claim their ancestry back to Avram. And there it says that Avram moved his tent and came to dwell at the terebinths of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and he built an altar there to the Lord. So he starts off at a terebinth of Moreh, and this is a different place. This is Mamre. It sounds similar, but it's a different root and it's a different word. But it's another place where he builds an altar. And again, Avraham does not build anything. He doesn't build a city. He doesn't dedicate a city like we have in other myths and other stories about ancient heroes and ancient patriarchs. They founded the city, not Avraham. He doesn't found any city. There's not one city that he dedicates. He dedicates the altars, and he is promised that his descendants will one day, this will be their land. So it's a very powerful scene because, again, it's not the only time we'll see it. We'll see it repeated, where Avraham is told that this land, we already saw it at the beginning of chapter 12, that this is going to be his land for his descendants. The problem is he's well into his 70s now, and he doesn't have any kids. And one of his potential kids just went the other direction. So Avram is probably also sitting here going, God, you keep telling me that this is for my descendants. Who are my descendants? I don't have any descendants. One of the guys who I kind of thought was my descendant, my nephew, just went the other direction. He's not even here anymore. Where are my kids? Where are my descendants? So Avram must be thinking this right now. He has to be thinking that. Has to be. So we're going to finish today with a story that a lot of people don't know. It's a story about Avraham that gives us another side of Avram. We've seen him in the first two chapters, in chapter 12 and 13. We've seen him have some definite challenges already. He's had his challenge of famine and Egypt, and now having some problems with his nephew. And all along the way, God is saying, I'm going to be with you. But Avram doesn't seem yet like he's been able to do too much on his own, in the sense that he seems to be seems to be being pushed around a little bit. He seems at the very least that he's being told what to do and trying to be accommodating and trying to be a guy who's trying to just, doing my part. I'm doing what you're telling me to do. I'll do what I have to do. I'll survive. I'll keep my head down. I'll unfortunately, in many ways, what we've seen in the first two chapters is, if some people would say, a typical Jewish response, which is whatever I have to do to survive. I have faith, I believe, but God's not making it easy, but I'm just not going to not going to make any waves. I'm just going to do what I have to do to get by. Not in chapter 14. Now we're going to see a different side of Avraham. And let's take a look at this part, which is where we're going to finish today. When King Amraphel of Shinar, King Arioch of Elasar, King Chedar Laomer of Elam, and King Tidal of Goyim. All right, that's some pretty big names, but they're also from pretty big kingdoms. Shinar and Elasar and Elam and Goyim. These are kingdoms of the east. These are four kings that are from the modern area of Mesopotamia. They're not Canaanite. They're actually Semite. They're actually the people that, according to the Bible, we're told that Avraham actually came from. He came from Shinar. He came from Bavel. He came from Elam, from this general area. He came from this area. So these are kind of Avraham's people. These are Eastern people. But they made war on King Berah of Sodom, King Birsha of Gomorrah, King Shinab of Admah, King Shem Eber of Zeboim, and King Bela, which is the king of Bela, which is Zoar, which again is 5 cities. 5 cities that are Canaanite cities. So we call this the war of the 4 kings versus the 5 kings. The 4 kings being the Eastern kings, the kings from the more powerful place at the time, Mesopotamia, against 5 Canaanite kings that are more like city-states, if you will, against maybe 4 kings of, I wouldn't say empires at the time, but they're already fairly large nations, if you will. So this doesn't seem like a fair battle, fair fight. Even though it's 4 versus 5, it's 4 really probably pretty powerful entities going to war against 5 of the local kings. Now, of course, Avraham is living amongst, and especially Lot is living amongst those 5 kings. He's living amongst the Canaanites. They're both living amongst the Canaanites. And it says they all joined forces, or it says all the latter, the 5 kings joined at the valley of Siddim, which is the Dead Sea. So this is where they are. And Siddim is different than Sodom. Sodom is with a samech, and Siddim is with a sin. So this is where they are. They're gathering together. The 5 local Canaanite kings are gathered together at the Dead Sea. So it says 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. So this kind of explains why the kings are coming to fight against them, because they had been serving them as vassals. They'd been paying tribute. And then after 12 years, they decide they don't want to serve them anymore. They're not going to pay this tribute to them anymore. And it says in the 14th year, so after a year, Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him came and defeated the Rephaim at Ashtarot, Karnaim, and the Zuzim at Ham, and the Emim at Shavar, Kiriataim, and the Horites in the hill country of Seir, as far as El Paran, which is in the wilderness. So it seems as though the eastern kings come out, and as they're coming out, they're defeating people. They're defeating some of these other entities, which may be pre-Canaanite, non-Canaanite, maybe they're Canaanite type peoples who are also in the area. The Horites are the original inhabitants of the area that will later be the Edomite territory. The Rephaim are living in the Zuzim, and the Emim are living in areas that are also going to be parts of, actually later on be parts of Israel, but Israel and Jordan. And so these Eastern kings are starting to, as they make their way to the Canaanites, Canaanite cities, especially again, these Canaanite cities that are in the valley of the Dead Sea area, that they're just beating everybody on their way. They're just rolling up, just beating everybody. And on their way back to Ein Mishpat, which is Kadesh, and subdued all the territory of the Amalekites and also the Amorites who dwelt at Chazazon Tamar. Now, what's interesting about this is, according to tradition, the Amalekites, or at least a tradition, the Amalekites are not around yet, in the sense that the Amalekites are descendants of Edom, of essentially Esau, which means they're descendants of Avram. The Amalekites are actually Abrahamic people based on the Torah, but it says the territory of Amalek. So we could say the Amalekites aren't there yet, but it's their area. It's that part of the Jordan, or that part of southern Israel where the Amalekites usually hang out. And again, it seems like the Amalekites are a nomadic warrior people, kind of like Bedouins that ride through. And as we've actually been reading in the book of Judges, they fight with the Midianites against us a lot. They go to war against us, and they seem to be really just bad people. We know that they attacked us when we came out of Egypt. They're our eternal enemies, but they maybe don't exist anymore, but it's their area. So these are peoples that are being defeated by Chedorlaomer's armies. And here's what happens. Then the king of Sodom, and the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar, went forth and engaged them in the battle of the valley of Siddim, which again is their territory. It's the area around the Dead Sea. King Chedorlaomer of Elam, King Tidal of Goyim, King Amraphel of Shinar, and King Arioch of Elasar, 4 kings against those 5. Now the valley of Siddim was dotted with bitumen pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah in their flight threw themselves into them, while the rest escaped to the hill country. The invaders seized all the wealth of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. Needless to say, it didn't seem like it worked out well for those 5 kings. It was as bad as it was for the other peoples. It seems pretty bad for them too. They get routed in battle, so much so that they're hiding out from these armies, and they literally throw themselves into these pits, into these holes, which really do dot the whole area around the Dead Sea. And so what do they do to save themselves? They throw themselves into these pits. Others of them escaped into the hill country, maybe into the tunnels, into the caves that are in the mountains.
Is it bitumen that tar, or what they put on Noah's Ark?
Yeah, it's tar, right? And
Nasty.
So it's very nasty. So the fact that they were going to throw themselves into these pits, these chemicals, these tar pits, tells you that they're scared to death. And literally, like, they're just hiding in places that no one will want to go to, because it's the only way they can survive, is to literally hide in garbage, or not in garbage, in chemical waste. So this is what they're doing in order to spare themselves. So things did not go well for these 5 kings. And again, like, you can see it. Well, everyone's losing to them. Of course, they're going to lose to them. So things do not go well for the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah. Their stuff gets taken. That's like they're routed. They come into the city and they take everything. They also took Lot, the son of Avram's brother, and all his possessions, and departed, for he had settled in Sodom. Wow. So we had just read literally a few verses ago, and we don't know how much time elapsed. In all fairness, it could be 30 years later, but let's not say it's 30 years later, but let's say time elapsed. But something happened in between the time that Lot, the last time we saw him, is a herdsman living with his cowboys and ranch hands, and now he's living in the city. Now you can make the argument that he became really, really successful and decided to leave the stables and the nomadic lifestyle or whatever of the tents, being out on the range, and he's living in the big city. But it's also possible that he decided he didn't want to be a herdsman anymore at all, and sold it all or lost it all and goes to live in the city. No matter what, this is not seen as good behavior on the part of Abraham and his descendants, namely you and I, that we already know, as we read, that Lot went to a city of wickedness. We already are told that they're wicked. We don't need to know anything else, but we shall know exactly what kind of behavior the Sodomites engage in. But what's interesting is we've already been told they're wicked. The Bible flat out told us that this is wickedness, and that Lot has chosen to live with these people. Now, we didn't know this yet. We didn't know he got taken. We didn't know he was even there. Avraham finds out. So maybe he knew where his nephew was living, but now he finds out that his nephew got taken. So we, as readers, now know that Lot is already living in the city, and a wicked city. So whatever Lot was doing, we don't know, and you can kind of imagine what was going through his mind. He was not living the life that Avraham would have wanted him to live, and things had not gone at least the way that Avraham would have wanted them to go for Lot. This does not seem to be a guy who's making good choices. So how does Avraham find out? A fugitive brought the news to Avram the Hebrew, who is dwelling in the terebinths of Mamre the Amorite, kinsman of Eshcol and Aner, these being Avram's allies. So Avram is still where we left him, at the terebinths of Mamre, the oaks of Mamre, in that grove out there, not far from Hebron. That's where he's living, which is not terribly far away, but let's say 25, 30 miles away. He's living there, and he's already become friends with some of the local people there, including, Eshcol and Aner, these Canaanite people that he's made alliances with. It shows you that Avram is at least powerful enough, or at least politically savvy enough, to become allies with some of the local Canaanite chieftains. When Avram heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he mustered his retainers born into his household, numbering 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. Dan is in the northern part of Israel, and of course, Dan is one of the 12 tribes. So the area, again, like the Amalekite territories, it's a kind of an anachronism. But the point is that it's like when we talk about the Romans fighting in France or Spain. They weren't called France or Spain then. They were later. We called them that later on, but at the time there was no France or Spain. So the Bible's doing something that, again, is normal. We talk about where these places are. It's really far north. He went really far north. And so what do we learn about Avram here is he is not afraid to go into battle. He took 318 people with him. But he seems like kind of a tough dude right now. This is a guy that up until this time doesn't seem to really take control of his life. And all of a sudden we see Avram going into battle and not being afraid to risk his life. And he's doing it for his nephew, who you could make the argument he didn't know anything to him. His nephew's herdsmen were already fighting with his herdsmen. You can make the argument he didn't owe his nephew anything. He didn't have to go after Lot, and Lot had made his decision already. He made his bed. He got into bed with the Sodomites, which already doesn't, by our own knowledge, is not a good thing to do. He's in bed with the Sodomites. He decided to live that way, and he can make the argument, well, he lived that way. This is what he has to do. It's not what Avram does. He goes and tries to rescue his nephew. At night, he and his servants deployed against them and defeated them. And he pursued them as far as Hovah, which is north of Damascus. So he keeps going north and he keeps going east towards Damascus. And it says he brought back all the possessions. He also brought back his kinsman Lot and all his possessions, and the women and the rest of the people. So what we just read is that Avraham went to war against the kings of the east, defeated them with a much smaller force, and took back not only his family, but all the stuff that the other king of Sodom, that the people of Sodom had lost, including these people's families that got taken in battle. That's what it says. And the women and the rest of the people. He went and rescued Sodom. He did. The king had nothing. And now he went there to rescue his nephew, but he ended up helping the people of Sodom. And when he returned from defeating Cheder Laomer and the kings with him, the king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, which is the valley of the king. That's what it's called. Valley of the king, Emek HaMelech. So he comes back into the land of Canaan after going as far north as Syria, comes back with the property. Now, if you've never read this story before, you're going to say, well, Avraham just brought all this stuff back. He's going to take a cut, right? He's got to take a cut. He risked his life. He risked his retainer, his household, his cowboys, if you will. He risked their lives. They risked their lives. What's he get? Well, before we get to that, and that's what we're going to finish with, it says that King Melchizedek, the king of Shalem, which is Jerusalem, Melech Shalem. There is a king of Jerusalem named Melchizedek, which is the king of righteousness. And it says the king of righteousness, that was his name, of Jerusalem, brought out bread and wine. And he was a priest of God the Most High, a Kohen El Elyon. So who is this Melchizedek? Who is this guy? Who is this mysterious man king who serves God and is a priest to God the Most High? Well, he seems to be a dude who understands God, because look at what this guy does. He blessed him, saying, "Blessed be Avram of God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your foes into your hand." And Avram gave him a tenth of everything. So Avram maybe was entitled to something, but he didn't take it. He gave it to King Melchizedek, who blessed him. So we really aren't sure what's going on here in this story. I have to tell you that. But something big has just happened because Avram just got blessed by this priest, this Melchizedek, who is a priest of God, and he seems to be a priest of our God. All the words that he's saying seem to be very consistent with the kinds of blessings that we have today. Now, I will tell you that King Melchizedek becomes very important in later on in other traditions. He's very important in Masonic traditions. He's very important in Mormon traditions, which, by the way, leads some to believe that that's where the Mormons got some of the Melchizedek traditions from. But Melchizedek seems to be a priest of God before there are Jews. Remember, Avraham is our first Jew, and this guy already seems to know what's going on. So who is this Melchizedek? Where did he come from? How did he get to know God? These are things we really don't know. But I will tell you that there seems to be an assumption that people knew who this Melchizedek was. And so there are lots of legends about Melchizedek. There's definitely stories about who he was and how he got there. But it definitely seems in this story to be a situation where this king ends up blessing him, and Avraham takes his place amongst the residents of Canaan in a very different way after this. And so it seems as though this Melchizedek might be from an order of people that were also recognizing God, but not Jews, not Hebrews, which again was why in some traditions, especially non-Jewish traditions, Melchizedek becomes the example of a Gentile who worships God. And that there's perhaps a Gentile church, if you will, a Gentile church then that predates in some ways, or at least goes back to our ancestry. So you could have a priesthood of Aaron, but you could also have a priesthood of Melchizedek. So we don't know. There's probably a story behind a story here of some rich oral traditions of Melchizedek that we just don't have. But needless to say, it's a speculation for Midrash and for other traditions that want to figure out who Melchizedek is.
El is a very old name for God.
What?
El is a very old name for God.
Yeah, and it's not only that, it's El Elyon. It's the Lord, the Most High, the Lord who's on the
the God, the Lord.
And he's the maker of heaven and earth.
Yeah.
So this is a wonderful, wonderful scene of Avram being blessed. Again, who is this Melchizedek? Definitely seems to be someone of importance. And here, the king of Sodom said to Avram, give me the persons and take the possessions for yourself. So just give me back my people. You can take everything else. Wow. Just give me my people back. But Avram said to the king of Sodom, I swear to the Lord, God Most High, this God that you just heard me blessed by Melchizedek. So maybe you understand a little bit of El Elyon. I'm going to just invoke him right now for all of you. El Elyon, Konesh Shemai V'Aretz, the one that he just talked about. I swear to that God, I will not take so much as a thread or a sandal strap of what is yours. You shall not say it is I who made Avram rich. For me, nothing but what my servants have used up. And as for a share of what the men who went with me, Aner, Eshkol, and Mamre, let them take their share. So he says to them, those people that are the other Canaanite guys, they can take whatever they want. You settle that out. But you, I'm taking nothing from you. And so what's really interesting about this is Avram says, I have nothing that you could ever say I took from you, that I took on your behalf, that you gave me permission. There's nothing that I want to be enriched by you. And so it's very interesting that Avraham seems to understand that dealing with the king of Sodom, it's not worth it. It's not worth doing anything with this guy. So he basically says, I'm taking nothing from you. These other guys, they can take what they want. You guys sit there and negotiate it. But me, I have no part of you. And this also will lead for, give us this understanding that Avram and the Jewish people, we had nothing to gain from Sodom and Gomorrah. That when Avraham ends up the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, he's already had interactions with them. He's helped them. He's got nothing in return from him. And on the contrary, He knows what they're about, and he doesn't want to have anything to do with them. But that doesn't mean that he won't act on their behalf, as we're about to see in the coming chapters. So with that, we're going to conclude tonight. Next week, we're going to read chapter 15, and another vision where Avraham is told again, you're going to be a father of many people, that you're going to be blessed. And Avraham must be, every time God's saying this to him, he's saying, well, when's it going to hit me? When do I get these kids? When do I get these things that you promised me? Avram doesn't have it yet. He's not having it yet. So we're not exactly sure how much time has passed, but it's definitely within 20 years since since Avraham has been told by God that you're going to have these things. So he's told at 75, that's when he starts his journey. He's now at maybe within the first 20 years or 20 years of that, but it's still, guy's getting up to 95 by now, and he's starting to wonder, am I ever going to really have these kids that God has told me I'm going to have? So that's where we're leaving off again. We do not have class next week. I want to wish everybody who I won't see a very happy and healthy Thanksgiving. We will be streaming services this Friday night with Rick and Addie from our place. Next week, we have a service that will be virtual on the Friday night, but we're going to have some pre-Hanukkah songs and some songs to get us in the mood for Hanukkah, which will start right after that. Right after that Thanksgiving holiday, we go right into our Hanukkah stuff. So again, hope everybody stays healthy and strong and stays positive.
On Tuesday?
We do have class on Tuesday, not on Wednesday. So again, we have some stuff going on with our family in the evenings for Thanksgiving. We try to build stuff around when we have family in town. My daughter Rachel has been in town this week. Dina's coming up on Friday. I mean, at some point in the next few days, I'm going to have my family all together, which is nice. They won't all be together, unfortunately, for Hanukkah, but for Thanksgiving, no, not even for Thanksgiving will they all be here. But this weekend, this Shabbos, if you come this Friday night, you'll actually see all my kids together, which will be nice because we haven't had everybody together since. We had them together for high holidays. I should say that. It just seems like a long time ago.
Yeah.
Everybody. Again, we're glad that David and Cheryl will be coming out. Have a safe journey. A lot of people are traveling in the next few days, and we want everybody to have safe and stress-free. To be as stress-free as possible as you hit the airports and the other places. We hope that it's as stress-free as possible, everybody. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Stay healthy.
Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.